Welcome to Blurr. What would you do if your government demanded control over the platform you built, and refusing meant losing everything? This is the story of Pavel Durov, the enigmatic tech billionaire who walked away from a social media empire, challenged powerful authorities, and went on to create Telegram, one of the world's most influential messaging apps. His journey is filled with ambition, innovation, conflict, and an unwavering belief in digital freedom. In Part 1, we'll uncover his early years, the rise of VKontakte, and the pivotal moments that set him on a collision course with power. Let's begin! Chapter 1. The Boy from Leningrad. There is a city in Russia that has worn many names. It was born as St. Petersburg, renamed Petrograd during the First World War, rechristened Leningrad under Soviet rule, and finally restored to St. Petersburg after the collapse of the USSR. It is a city that knows what it means to reinvent itself. A city built on ambition and water, on imperial dreams and terrible suffering, on the belief that sheer force of human will can reshape the world. It is fitting then that this city produced Pavel Valeryevich Durov, a man who would spend his entire life reinventing not just himself, but the very fabric of how human beings communicate. St. Petersburg, even in its Soviet incarnation as Leningrad, retained something of the cultural grandeur of the city Peter the Great had built by imperial decree on the marshy shores of the Gulf of Finland. Its canals and Baroque palaces, its great universities and libraries, tradition of intellectual life and artistic achievement. These did not disappear under Soviet rule, even if they were bent to different purposes. The city had produced Dostoevsky and Brodsky, had been the stage for revolution and siege, endured unimaginable suffering during the 900-day German blockade of World War II, and had survived. Something in the city's character, a combination of beauty and toughness, of high culture and hard practicality, shaped everyone who grew up within it. Pavel was born on October 10, 1984, in Leningrad, to a family that prized the life of the mind above almost everything else. His father, Valery Durov, was a professor of classical philology, a scholar of ancient languages, Latin and Greek, the tongues of civilizations long gone. His mother worked in academia as well. This was not a household where television dominated the evenings. This was a household of books, of ideas, of careful thought, and deliberate learning. Pavel and his older brother Nikolai grew up breathing intellectual air, and it shaped them both profoundly. Nikolai, born 5 years earlier in 1980, would go on to become one of the most gifted mathematicians of his generation. Two brothers shared a bond that transcended ordinary sibling affection. They thought alike, built alike, dreamed alike. In the years to come, Nikolai's mathematical genius would provide the technical foundation for everything Pavel sought to create. But that is a story for later chapters. When Pavel was still a young child, his father accepted a research position in Italy, and the family relocated to Turin. This was the late 1980s, the tail end of the Cold War, when the Soviet 1980s, the tail end of the Cold War. Union was beginning to crack at its seams. For young Pavel, the move to Italy was revelatory. He encountered a world of color and freedom that stood in startling contrast to the gray uniformity of Soviet life. He attended school in Turin, learned Italian, and absorbed the Western European idea that the individual matters, that personal expression is not merely permitted but celebrated. The family returned to Russia in the early 1990s, just as the Soviet Union was dissolving, came back to a country in the midst of seismic transformation. The old certainties had crumbled. New possibilities were stirring in the rubble. For a sharp-minded boy entering adolescence, it was a dizzying and electrifying time. Pavel attended the academic gymnasium of St. Petersburg State University, an elite secondary school attached to one of Russia's greatest universities. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional student, not merely in the narrow sense of someone who performs well on examinations, but in the broader sense of someone whose mind genuinely hungers for knowledge. He was drawn to languages, to philosophy, to the deep structures that underlie human thought and communication. He won several academic Olympiads in linguistics, competed at the national level, and demonstrated early on that he had a rare gift, the ability to perceive patterns where others saw only noise. He was also, even at this young age, something of an outsider. He was not cold or antisocial, but he possessed an independence of spirit that set him slightly apart. He did not follow trends. He did not feel compelled to conform. He watched his peers with a certain detachment, not unkindly, but with the quiet curiosity of someone who observes the world more than he participates in it on its own terms. This quality, this willingness to stand apart and think for himself, would define his entire life. After completing his secondary education with distinction, Pavel enrolled at St. Petersburg State University in the Faculty of Philology. He studied linguistics, took courses in philosophy, and continued to excel. But the early 2000s were also the years when the internet was beginning to transform human civilization, and Pavel, like so many young people of his generation, felt its pull with tremendous force. While he valued his classical education, he was increasingly consumed by the possibilities of the digital world. Here was a new kind of language, code, and a new kind of communication that could transcend every border, every boundary, every wall that governments and geographies had erected between human beings. He was 20 years old when the idea first began to take shape. A social network, not merely a directory or a messaging board, but a genuine digital community, a place where Russian students could find each other, connect with each other, share their lives with each other. The concept was not entirely original. Mark Zuckerberg had launched Facebook at Harvard that same year, 2004. But Russia was a different world, with different needs, different constraints, and a different culture. Pavel believed he could build something that would speak directly to Russian speakers. Something that would be theirs. He was right. Chapter 2. VKontakte, the Russian Facebook. The story of how VKontakte came into being is, in many ways, the story of a young man moving faster than the world around him expected. Pavel was 22 years old when the site launched in 26. He had recently graduated from university. He had no venture capital backing, no team of experienced engineers, no business plan in the conventional sense. What he had was a clear vision, a ferocious work ethic, and his brother Nikolai. The name VKontakte means in contact in Russian, a simple, direct declaration of purpose. The site was designed from the outset to be intuitive, fast, and inclusive. Unlike some of the Western social networks that were beginning to reach Russian users, VKontakte felt native. The interface was clean. The features were well chosen, and perhaps most importantly, it was free. Free to join, free to use, free to share. The technical challenges of building a social network from scratch in 2006 were not trivial. The infrastructure required to handle millions of users, to store their photographs and messages and social graphs, to serve pages quickly to users on varying internet connections across a vast country. All of this required careful engineering decisions made early. When the pressure to ship and attract users was at its most intense, Pavel made these decisions with unusual confidence for someone his age. He was not second-guessing himself. He had a clear picture of what he was building and why, and he moved toward that picture with the directness of someone who does not spend much time worrying about failure. Pavel promoted the site initially through his university networks, offering small cash payments to students who referred their friends. It was a scrappy, guerrilla approach to marketing, and it worked with astonishing speed. Within months, hundreds of thousands of users had signed up. Within a year, the number was in the millions. The platform grew at a rate that stunned observers in both Russia and the West. By 2007, VKontakte was the most visited website in Russia. By 2008, It had tens of millions of registered users. By the early 2010s, it would claim over 200 million registered accounts. The growth brought resources, and Pavel deployed those resources with characteristic boldness. He hired engineers, designers, and product managers. He rented office space in St. Petersburg. But he also maintained a culture that was distinctly his own. Flat, informal, intensely focused on building rather than managing. He was not a traditional CEO. He did not wear suits to work. He did not hold lengthy meetings or produce elaborate organizational charts. He led by example, by intensity, by sheer force of creative vision. VKontakte became more than a social network. Teenagers grew up on it. Russian artists and musicians used it to share their work. Russian dissidents used it to organize and communicate. Russian families used it to stay in touch across the vast distances of the country. For many users, VKontakte was not just a website. It was the internet. It was the place where their digital lives happened. Pavel, meanwhile, was developing a persona that was as striking as his platform. He was photographed in minimalist clothing, black t-shirts, plain trousers, that he would later formalize into a near uniform. He made provocative public statements. He drove expensive cars through St. Petersburg at high speed. He dropped money from his office window, literally throwing banknotes to passers-by on the street below. An act of theatrical generosity or theatrical provocation, depending on how you interpreted it. He was cultivating a mythology, whether consciously or not, and the Russian public was fascinated by it. He was also, beneath the theatrics, deeply serious about certain principles. From the beginning, Pavel held strong views about privacy, about user autonomy, and about the relationship between technology platforms and government power. These were not merely abstract political positions. They were convictions forged in the specific context of post-Soviet Russia, where the memory of state surveillance and censorship was still very much alive. He believed that people had a right to communicate freely, without interference. He believed that a technology platform had an obligation to protect its users from those who would silence them. These convictions would soon be tested in ways he could not have imagined. As VKontakte grew in influence, it inevitably attracted the attention of Russia's political establishment. The Kremlin watched the platform's role in political organizing with unease. The Arab Spring of 2010 and 2011 had demonstrated the power of social media to catalyze political upheaval, and Russian authorities were acutely aware of this precedent. When protests broke out in Russia in 2011 and 2012, driven in significant part by opposition to Vladimir Putin's return to the presidency, VKontakte was one of the primary tools through which demonstrators organized. The pressure on Pavel began to build. Government officials made informal requests that were, in the context of Russian power, difficult to distinguish from demands. They asked for information about opposition activists. They asked for communities to be shut down. In some cases, Pavel complied to limited degrees, removing content that he judged to clearly violate Russian law. In other cases, he refused. He was publicly defiant. On one occasion, he responded to a government takedown request with a photograph of a shirtless man giving the middle finger. The message was unambiguous. This was extraordinarily brave behavior in Russia, where the cost of defying the state could be very high indeed. It was also, for Pavel personally, increasingly costly in more practical ways. The ownership structure of VKontakte had grown complicated. External investors had acquired significant stakes in the company, and some of those investors had relationships, direct or indirect, with people close to the Kremlin. The platform that Pavel had built was slowly being encircled. The details of what happened next are complex and disputed, but the broad outline is clear. Between 2013 and 2014, Pavel lost control of VKontakte. His shares were acquired, some would say forced out, by investors aligned with powerful Russian interests, including the media conglomerate Mail.ru Group, which had connections to figures in Putin's inner circle. In April 2014, Pavel announced that he had been fired as CEO. He had been the founder, the visionary, the public face of the company he built. And now it was no longer his. He left Russia. He would not return for years, and he was already thinking about what he would build next. Chapter 3. Exile and Telegram. Pavel Durov departed Russia in April 2014 with something that many exiles do not have: a plan. Not a vague aspiration or a wounded desire for revenge, but a concrete, fully articulated plan for what he was going to build next and why it had to be built. He had been thinking about it for more than a year before he left. The plan was Telegram. Telegram had actually already launched, quietly, in August 2013. While Pavel was still fighting for control of VKontakte, he and Nikolai had been working on it in the background, motivated by a specific and personal experience. Pavel recounted later that the inspiration came from an evening when FSB agents, officers of Russia's Federal Security Service, the successor to the KGB, had come to his apartment door. They did not enter. They had no warrant that compelled him to comply with whatever they wanted. They left. But the experience crystallized something for him: the need for a genuinely secure channel of communication, one that not even the most powerful state apparatus could easily penetrate. This was the founding vision of Telegram, not simply another messaging app. The world already had messaging apps, but a messaging app built on security and privacy as primary values rather than afterthoughts. An app where your messages were yours, where the servers could not easily hand over your conversations to governments, where encryption was not a premium feature, but the default condition of every communication. The early days of Telegram's development were intense and demanding. Pavel and Nikolai worked with a small, trusted team to build the core architecture that would need to support, eventually, hundreds of millions of users. The decisions made in those early months about encryption, about server architecture, about how data would be stored and where, would have consequences for years, creating both strengths and vulnerabilities in the platform's design. Nikolai Durov's mathematical genius was central to this vision. He designed the mProto encryption protocol that underpins Telegram's Telegram security architecture. mProto has been the subject of considerable debate in the cryptography community over the years. Some experts have praised it. Others have raised questions about specific design choices, particularly regarding the use of custom cryptographic approaches rather than widely adopted standards. But its core purpose is clear and sincere: to make it as difficult as possible for third parties to intercept and read private communications. The cryptographic community, which tends toward conservatism in its recommendations, generally prefers established, widely peer-reviewed protocols to novel designs, however brilliant the designer. This technical debate about mProto reflects a broader tension in Telegram's approach. The confidence, bordering on arrogance, of people who believe they can solve problems better than existing solutions, versus the wisdom of standing on the shoulders of accumulated community knowledge. It is a tension that runs throughout Pavel's career and his personality. After leaving Russia, Pavel spent several years in a kind of nomadic existence. He traveled extensively, spending time in multiple countries, exploring the question of where Telegram should be based. He considered several European cities, spent time in Berlin, and eventually settled on Dubai in the United Arab Emirates as the company's operational home base, though Telegram's legal structure remained distributed across multiple jurisdictions. The choice of Dubai was pragmatic: a favorable tax environment, a cosmopolitan business culture, and strategic positioning between Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. During these years, Telegram grew with a velocity that surprised even its creators. The app had launched in an environment where WhatsApp dominated messaging, but Telegram offered something different. Not just security, but also features that WhatsApp lacked: large group chats, channels for broadcasting to unlimited audiences, bots that could automate tasks and deliver content, stickers and expressive tools that made communication feel richer and more personal. The ability to send files of virtually any type and size without compression. A consistent experience across every platform: phone, tablet, desktop, because Telegram was built from the beginning to be truly cross-platform. Users in countries where freedom of expression was under pressure discovered Telegram quickly. Iranian activists, Hong Kong protesters, Belarusian dissidents, journalists working in dangerous environments, all of them turned to Telegram because it offered something that felt genuinely protective. The app became embedded in the infrastructure of civil society movements around the world, but Telegram also attracted less admirable users. Criminal networks, extremist groups, and purveyors of illegal content discovered the platform's relative permissiveness and made use of it. This became an ongoing and painful tension for Pavel, one that he has never fully resolved, and that would, years later, bring him into direct conflict with Western legal systems. Pavel's public statements during these years were characteristically uncompromising. He argued that privacy was an absolute value, not a relative one that could be adjusted based on the nature of the user seeking protection. He argued that a platform that installed backdoors for governments, even governments with legitimate reasons for wanting them, was a platform that had been fundamentally compromised. He refused to comply with governmental requests for user data. He refused to block content on political grounds. In 2018, Russia attempted to block Telegram entirely. The Federal Security Service demanded that Telegram provide the encryption keys needed to decrypt user messages. Pavel refused. Russia's communications regulator, Roskomnadzor, ordered internet service providers to block access to the app. In a darkly comic sequence of events, the Russian authorities then proceeded to block millions of IP addresses, including those belonging to Amazon and Google, in their attempt to cut off Telegram, causing widespread collateral damage to Russian internet services, while Telegram users found workarounds with little difficulty. The ban was eventually lifted in 2020, a quiet admission of failure. The episode reinforced Pavel's public image as a defender of digital freedom, a tech entrepreneur who was genuinely willing to pay significant costs rather than compromise his principles. Whether one fully agrees with his positions or not, the sincerity of his commitment was demonstrated by his action. He did not capitulate. Throughout this period, Pavel was also building something equally important: his personal brand. His social media presence, particularly his Telegram channel, became a platform for philosophical musings, lifestyle commentary, and pronouncements on technology and freedom. He shared his views on diet. He was increasingly committed to a regimen of physical discipline and dietary restriction that he credited with keeping him sharp. He shared photographs and reflections from his travels. He presented himself as something of a philosopher-entrepreneur, a man who had rejected the conventions of corporate life in favor of a more examined, more intentional existence. He had no fixed address. He traveled constantly. He claimed citizenship from multiple countries. St. Kitts and Nevis had granted him citizenship through its investment program. France would later do the same. He described himself as a citizen of the world, unbeholden to any single nation's claims on his loyalty. This statelessness, chosen, deliberate, and philosophically justified, would eventually become one of the most consequential facts of his life. Chapter 4. The Philosophy of Freedom. To understand Pavel Durov, you need to understand that he is not merely a tech entrepreneur who happens to have strong opinions about privacy. He is a man with a comprehensive worldview, a coherent philosophy that informs everything from his business decisions to his diet to his choice of where to live. That philosophy can be described, at its core, as a form of radical individualism, The belief that the autonomous individual, free from undue constraint by governments, corporations, or social convention, is the fundamental unit of meaningful human life. This philosophy has roots in the specific context of his upbringing. He was born in the Soviet Union, a system that subordinated every individual to the collective will as expressed through the Communist Party. He lived his formative years in a country transitioning out of that system, watching the extraordinary human energy that was released when people were suddenly free to pursue their own visions. He saw, at close range, what happens when a powerful state decides that individual expression is a threat to be managed rather than a value to be protected. The Russia he eventually fled was not the Soviet Union, but it was, in his view, moving in a direction that he found deeply alarming. His commitment to privacy as a value flows directly from this historical experience. He does not frame privacy as a preference or a convenience. He frames it as a prerequisite for human dignity. In a world without private communication, he argues, there can be no genuine dissent, no authentic organizing, no real opposition to power. The ability to speak to another person without a third party listening is not a luxury. It is the foundation of political freedom. This argument has both considerable merit and significant complications. The merit is real. Throughout history, the ability of states to monitor communication has been a powerful tool of oppression. The complications are also real. The same privacy that protects political dissidents also protects criminals, and a platform that genuinely resists law enforcement pressure will inevitably become attractive to those who wish to evade it. Pavel has acknowledged this tension, but he has acknowledged this tension, consistently resolved it in favor of privacy. His argument, stated with varying degrees of elaboration over the years, goes roughly as follows. The harm caused by creating surveillance infrastructure, the chilling effect on legitimate speech, the risk of that infrastructure being misused, the fundamental violation of human dignity, outweighs the harm caused by allowing some criminals to use secure communication tools. Criminals, after all, have other tools available. What they do not have in an unencrypted world is the same beyond privacy. Pavel's philosophy encompasses a broader critique of the modern technology industry. He is deeply skeptical of what he sees as the cozy relationships between major technology platforms and governments, particularly the American government. He believes that platforms like Facebook, Google, and WhatsApp, which is owned by Meta, Facebook's parent company, have become instruments of surveillance that are fundamentally incompatible with genuine user freedom. He points to revelations about government access to user data, to the design choices that prioritize engagement over well-being, to the ways in which these platforms have used their power to shape discourse, often in ways that serve institutional interests. He has been strikingly willing to criticize Apple and Google as well, the two companies that control the smartphone platforms through which most people access Telegram. He has argued that their control of app distribution gives them a form of power over communication that is unhealthy for civilization. When Apple required changes to Telegram's content policies as a condition of remaining in the App Store, Pavel made the App Store disagreement public rather than simply complying in silence. His own lifestyle embodies his philosophy in ways that can seem eccentric or extreme, but are internally consistent. He maintains a strict diet that he has described in some detail: minimal processed food, significant fasting, a commitment to physical health that he connects explicitly to mental clarity and productive capacity. He exercises regularly. He sleeps carefully. He describes these practices not as asceticism for its own sake, but as a form of optimization, a deliberate effort to keep his mind and body functioning at the highest possible level. He has spoken critically of alcohol and recreational drugs. He has spoken approvingly of practices associated with the quantified self-movement, the use of data and discipline to maximize human performance. There is something in all of this that resonates with a certain tradition of tech founder mythology. The genius who operates outside conventional rules, who has transcended ordinary human limitations through a combination of intellectual power and iron discipline. Silicon Valley has produced several such figures, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, and Pavel Durov fits the archetype in many ways. He is brilliant, he is disciplined, he is visionary, and he is not always comfortable to be around if you prefer your environments conventional. But there is also something in Pavel's philosophy that goes beyond the Silicon Valley archetype. His is not primarily a philosophy of disruption for profit. It is a philosophy of resistance to power, to surveillance, to the comfortable complicity of large institutions with the interests of states. He has paid real costs for this resistance. He lost his company, he lost his country. He has lived for years without a stable home, without the security that most people of his wealth and status would consider a minimum requirement of comfortable life. Whether these costs were freely chosen or were, in some measure, imposed by circumstances he could not fully control is a question worth sitting with. But the fact of the costs is not in dispute. He is, by his own account and by the account of those who know him, a man who genuinely believes what he says. This does not make him right about everything, but it makes him interesting, and makes him, in a technology industry full of people who say one thing and do another, genuinely distinctive. And that concludes part 1 of Pavel Durov's remarkable journey. We followed his rise from a talented student to the founder of Russia's largest social network, witnessing the challenges and decisions that would shape his future. But the most dramatic chapter is still ahead. In part 2, we'll explore the birth of Telegram, Durov's exile from Russia, his global influence, and the controversies that continue to surround him today. If you enjoyed this audiobook, please like, subscribe, and then hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story from Blurr. And tell us in the comments, do you see Pavel Durov as a tech genius, a freedom advocate, or something else entirely? Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in part 2.